Hello, this is the Hispanic Latino American Culture Reading for American Diversity. Hispanic Americans are white Americans of Spanish speaking descent. Latino Americans are Americans of Latin American descent. Many Hispanic Americans are the descendants of Mexican people who lived in the Southwest when it became part of the United States. Almost all other Latino and Hispanic Americans or their ancestors migrated to the United States from Latin America. The three largest Latino or Hispanic groups in the United States are Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans. As a group, Hispanic Americans represent a mixture of several ethnic backgrounds, including European, American Indian, and African. Although the native residents of Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens, Puerto Rico is not a U.S. state. The U.S. Census Bureau therefore does not count the island native residents as part of the U.S. population. In this article, the term Hispanic American applies only to Puerto Ricans who have migrated from the island and live in the United States. Today, roughly 57 million Hispanic Americans live in the U.S., which makes up about 18% of the overall U.S. population. They make up the largest minority group in the country. Hispanics are also the fastest growing U.S. minority as a result of a high birth rate and continuing immigration. Most Latino and Hispanic Americans speak English, but continue to use Spanish and Portuguese as well. Spanish speakers form the largest language minority in the United States. In addition to their language, Hispanic Americans have preserved many other traditions of their homeland. Hispanic, Latino food, music, clothing style, and architecture have greatly influenced U.S. culture. Some Latino people in the United States describe themselves simply as Americans. Most, however, identify themselves with their cultural or national background and refer to themselves as Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Brazilian American, Cuban American, Colombian American, or Costa Rican American, etc. Who are the Hispanic Americans? According to the census, nearly 64% of all Hispanics in the United States are Mexican Americans. Puerto Ricans make up about 9% of Hispanic population, and Cuban Americans about 3.5%. The Spanish language and the Roman Catholic religion are among the oldest and most important cultural bonds that unite the entire group. During Spain's colonial period, which lasted from the 1500s to the 1800s, Spanish missionaries and landlords spread their language and religion throughout the areas they controlled. As a result, even today, most Latinos can speak Spanish to a certain degree, and the majority are Roman Catholics. Within the Hispanic American minority, there are people of different national and ethnic origins. Physical appearances vary widely and often shows the blending of European, American Indian, and African features that has occurred over many generations. Most Mexican Americans are mestizo. Mestizo means that an individual is of European and Native American ancestry. White ancestors were mostly Spaniards who colonized what are now Mexico and the American Southwest. Their Indian ancestors were living in these regions when the Spaniards arrived. Many poor Puerto Ricans are mulatto. Mulatto are a mix of Spanish and African descent, with their African ancestors having been brought over by the Spaniards to work as slaves. Other Puerto Ricans have some American Indian ancestry as well. Most Cuban Americans are of Spanish descent, though some Black and mulattoes have also immigrated from Cuba. Where do Hispanic Americans live? About 90% of Hispanic Americans live in urban areas, particularly Los Angeles, New York City, Miami, San Francisco, Chicago, and many cities in the Southwest. About one third of all Puerto Ricans living on the mainland in New York City. The New York City area is also home to a large group of Hispanics from Colombia, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Chicago has large Mexican American, Puerto Rican, and Cuban American populations. Hispanic influences on American culture. Hispanics in the United States share many of the traditional values claimed by most Americans. They place a high value on their families and success through hard work. They are also proud of their Latin American heritage. Many Hispanic Americans feel that they should not lose contact with their cultures or their language. Instead, they seek to be bicultural and bilingual. Food. Food is one of the areas in which Hispanic influences are very apparent in the United States. Mexican foods are especially popular. The taco, a folded tortilla filled with meat, cheese, and other ingredients, is as common in some areas as hamburgers and hot dogs. Other Mexican dishes, such as enchiladas, tamales, and tostadas, are also served in restaurants throughout the United States. However, not all Latino American cultures have the taco at the center of their cuisine. Entertainment and arts. Since the 1940s, the music and dances of Latin America have also crossed over into American culture. Mexican mariachi bands, small ensembles usually consisting of violins, guitars, and trumpets, have long enjoyed popularity in the United States. Dances and dance music from the Caribbean islands, especially Cuba, were first performed in American ballrooms in the late 1800s. Some popular Cuban dances have included the bamba, the cha cha cha, the conga, the mambo, the rumba, and salsa. Much of the music and dancing was derived from the culture of African slaves who worked on West Indian sugar plantations from the early 1500s to the 1800s. The music has strong, irregular, accented rhythms. It features instruments of African and American Indian origin, including conga drums, claves, maracas, and marimbas. A popular performer of traditional Latin music was Cecilia Cruz. Known as La Reina de la Salsa, Cruz performed for more than 50 years in both Cuba and the United States. Some other Hispanic American performers have gained widespread popularity. For example, they are Richie Valens, Carlos Santana, Gloria Estefan, and the group Los Lobos. In sports, some well known Hispanic American athletes include baseball greats Roberto Clemente, Alex Rodriguez, and Sammy Sosa, golfers Nancy Lopez, Lee Trevino, and horse jockeys Angel Cordero and Jorge Vasquez. Holidays. Many Hispanic Americans observe the major holidays of their homelands in addition to the U.S. holidays. Mexican Americans celebrate the anniversary of Mexico's independence from Spain on September 16th, Cinco de Mayo, which commemorates Mexico's victory over an invading French army on May 5th, 1862. Puerto Rican observe Constitution Day on July 25th, the day on which Puerto Rico's Constitution became effective in 1952. And Cuban Americans celebrate Cuban Independence Day on May 20th, the date Cuba gained its independence from Spain in 1898. History of Hispanic Latino American immigration. To the west, the desire for wealth and fame led the Spaniards to expand their claims in Mexico. In 1540, the explorer Francisco Vasquez de Coronado set out to conquer the legendary cities of Cibola, which were said to lie north of Mexico. Coronado and his men explored areas of present day New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas in hope of finding the great riches they had heard described. The expedition returned to Mexico in 1542. No gold had been found, but Coronado had explained to vast area of the North American continent to the rulers of Spain. The area was given the name New Mexico. In 1598, the first Spanish settlers arrived in New Mexico to begin missionary work among the Pueblo Indians. The settlers established Santa Fe as the capital of New Mexico in 1609. The Spaniards treated the Indians harshly, and in 1680, the Pueblo Indians revolted. The Indians killed about 400 Spaniards and captured Santa Fe. California was also part of the Spanish Empire in the New World. First settled by the Spaniards in 1769, California remained sparsely populated for many years. By the end of 1820, Franciscan friars had established 21 missions in California. The Spanish governors had also built a number of forts in California. The abundant resources of California attracted many American settlers in the 1830s and 1840s. The United States was already considering ways of acquiring California. The Californians enjoyed the benefits of their trade with the United States. The Mexican government neglected its northern territories, and many Californians resented the interference of government officials from Mexico City, so California sought to become a U.S. territory. Texas had by far the smallest population of any of the northern Mexican territories, and the Mexican government's hold on Texas was weak. In 1821, in January, American merchants Moses Austin received permission from Spanish authorities in Mexico to settle 300 Americans in Texas. The project eventually passed into the hands of Austin's son, Stephen Fuller Austin. Instead of being limited to 300 settlers, however, the American settlement of Texas was thousands of people. In fact, in 1836, Texas won its independence from Mexico and became a republic. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas in response to the Mexican government broke off relations with the United States. Texas claimed territory as far south as the Rio Grande, but Mexico disputed the claim. These and other events led to the Mexican American War of 1846 to 1848. The United States won that war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, awarded the United States the territory that now makes up the states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of New Mexico and Arizona, and part of Colorado and Wyoming. This vast area was home to approximately 80,000 Mexicans, most of whom were granted U.S. citizenship. This conflict plummeted Mexico into years of political and economic chaos. Despite the gains that Mexican Americans have made after becoming U.S. citizens, they still suffered discrimination in jobs, wages, and housing. To fight these conditions, the organized labor unions took part in strikes to obtain higher wages and better working conditions. Mexican Americans also formed civic groups to deal with their problems. In 1929, the major groups merged to form the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. Immigration restrictions and growing discrimination. In 1917, the United States passed a law requiring all adult immigrants to be able to read and write at least one language. In 1924, the U.S. Bureau of Immigration established the Border Patrol to control illegal immigration across the U.S. and Mexican border. Strict enforcement of the 1917 adult literacy law led to a decline in Mexican immigration in the late 1920s. This decline continued throughout the Great Depression. In addition to the adult literacy laws and repatriation, Mexican Americans suffered from other forms of discrimination. During the early 1900s, many restaurants refused to serve Mexican Americans. Public swimming pools, restrooms, drinking fountains, and in theaters often segregated. Mexican American children were often forbidden to speak Spanish in school and were sometimes punished severely for doing so. Puerto Rican migration. The mid 1900s also brought the first great wave of people from Puerto Rico. This island has been a U.S. possession since 1898, and its people had been U.S. citizens since 1917. As a citizen, Puerto Ricans may enter the United States without restrictions. Between 1940 and 1960, more than 500,000 Puerto Ricans came to the U.S. mainland to look for jobs. By 1960, almost 70% of Puerto Ricans living in the mainland had settled in East Harlem in New York City. Cuban immigration to the United States picked up sharply during the late 1950s as a result of increasing political turmoil in Cuba. Until the mid 50s, only a few thousand Cubans came to the United States each year. But during the late 50s and early 60s, the number of Cuban immigrants increased dramatically. In 1959, Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro came to power. He announced the restructuring of Cuban society. Many middle and upper class Cubans found Castro's plan threatening to their way of life. Between 1959 and late 1962, about 200,000 anti Castro Cubans immigrated to the United States, the majority settling in Florida. In 1994, thousands of Cubans set out for Florida on small boats and rafts to escape poverty in Cuba. United States immigration officials sent the refugees to U.S. military bases in Panama and Guantanamo Bay on the Cuba coast. Many of the refugees were eventually admitted to the United States, but to avoid the costs of settling a large number of additional people in the U.S., some were later returned to Cuba. Nearly two-thirds of all Cuban Americans live in Florida. Political developments. Until the 1960s, discrimination at the polls discouraged many Latinos from registering to vote. Some states required the payment of a poll tax before a person was allowed to vote. The tax was intended to keep Hispanics, African Americans, and other minorities, many of whom were poor and too poor to afford the tax, from voting. In large areas with large Hispanic populations, voting district boundaries were often drawn to scatter the Hispanic voters over several districts. This practice, called gerrymandering, held down the percentage of Hispanic voters within any one district. The Chicano movement. In spite of the success of a growing number of Hispanic Americans, many others became more resentful about their problems. Among Mexican Americans in particular, such feelings found expression in the Chicano movement, also called Brown Power movement, founded in the 1960s. Although the origin of the word Chicano is uncertain, some Mexican Americans have considered the term negative label for their ethnic group. But by founding the Chicano movement, it promoted ethnic pride. One of the foremost Hispanic Americans to reflect that new ethnic pride was Cesar Chavez, a later labor leader who began to organize California's grape pickers in 1962. Education. The earliest programs designed to improve public education for Hispanic and Latino students was bilingual education. In 1968, the United States government began to fund bilingual programs for students who did not speak English as their first language. In early bilingual programs serving Hispanics, students were taught in Spanish in such basic subjects as math and science. Meanwhile, they studied English as a second language. When they were ready, they transferred to classes taught only in English. By the 1990s, many schools have replaced that transitional approach to bilingual education with two-way bilingual education, also called dual language or developmental bilingual education.